Hi, everyone. Welcome, Nomad community. How are y'all doing tonight? I hope everyone is staying safe out there. But before we jump in, I would love to know where everyone is calling in from tonight. So why don't you drop your location in the chat? Dustin and I are in the Eastern Sierras. We've been here for a while. It's hard to leave when a place is so beautiful. Pasadena, Salt Lake, Boston, Winnipeg. Wow, Mississippi, Florida, the White Mountains, Seattle. This is so exciting. Lafayette, Louisiana. Louisiana in the house, yes. Wyoming, oh my goodness, the Badlands, South Dakota, San Diego. This is so exciting. Welcome everyone. Reno, Nevada. I love seeing where everyone is calling in from. Thank you all for being here tonight. I am Naomi, the founder of Diversify Vanlife. Some of you may know me from my personal platform, Irie to Aurora. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this very, very important workshop. And thank you for supporting the Diversify Vanlife movement and our growing community as we take up space in the nomadic world. In my 4 years as a nomad, I saw a clear lack of representation of BIPOC and other marginalized groups in the nomadic community. This made it very difficult for me as a Black woman to navigate these spaces where my voice and my experiences were not represented in the overall narrative. And I knew that I wasn't alone. So when I started Diversify Vanlife last year, which is about 9 months ago, it was out of a desperate need to find community that I could relate to and create a space where other BIPOC could feel encouraged to pursue this lifestyle. I mean, nobody wants to be the only one represented, right? We demand representation, not tokenism. Things are slowly changing as more and more BIPOC are pursuing nomadic lifestyles. So how do we create a more inclusive community? True inclusivity takes work, which is why we're all here tonight. So thank you for showing up. But before we jump in, I want to take a moment to introduce our community manager at Diversify Vanlife, Anais Monique. She is the powerful voice in our social media. So Anais, would you like to say a few words?
Hi everyone, I'm your community manager. I'm on the DM, so I see a lot of familiar faces. It's really awesome to share that space with you, and I'm happy you are all here. I'm happy to share this space with you too.
Thank you, Anais. Next, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, LifeStraw, for supporting the Diversify Vanlife community and for making this event possible. Dustin and I have had the pleasure of working with LifeStraw on several projects over the past year, and we couldn't be happier to align with such a great company. We have some representatives from the LifeStraw team joining us tonight. I'd like to turn it over to Tara and Jasmine to say a few words.
Hi everyone, I'm Tara, head of brand at LifeStraw, and Jasmine is our content and community manager who literally just joined us today, so I'm gonna let her sit back and hang out. But I'll make this super brief. I just wanna thank Naomi for your partnership and your leadership in creating such an important community and ongoing conversation really in Diversified Vanlife. And it's just a pleasure and a privilege to support such a clearly relevant and important topic and event. And wow, the amazing response and the number of people from all over that are here. It is so cool to see. So it's just such a pleasure to be part of this. And also thank you to Denisha for coming on board to lead this conversation. Really looking forward to it. And with that said, I am going to shut up and listen.
Thank you, Tara. One more thing before we jump in. I promise we're going to get there. Our tech support, Dustin, my partner, is going to just run everyone through like what they need to know to be able to engage tonight. Dustin.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I am sitting beside Naomi. Since we have such a big turnout tonight, we're going to keep everyone muted so we can avoid the chaos and get the most out of tonight's workshop. So please ask your questions in the chat. Naomi, Anais, and I will be fielding questions, and our facilitator will answer them at the appropriate time. We encourage you to engage in the chat, but we ask that you please be respectful of each other and of this space that we're creating here tonight. That being said, should you have any issues with connectivity, you can turn off your video to reduce bandwidth, and that should help it come in smoother. And if you can't find the chat, down at the bottom of your screen, there should be a menu bar, and you should find chat. And if you click it, it'll give you a pop out to the side. So with that said, I'm going to turn it back over to Naomi.
Thank you, Dustin. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our facilitator for tonight's event, Denisha Nina Jenkins. Nina is an equity and inclusion consultant, a speaker, and anti-racism educator. Nina, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for showing up. I'm pleasantly surprised. And so I want to thank you all for joining. I hope this can be as interactive as possible. So please share in the comments. If you are a note taker, absolutely take notes. There'll be a couple of prompts that I'll use, and I would love to hear from you through the comment section. So thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen and get started here. Okay. Can you all see it yet? It's slowly coming through. So as my screen is coming up, I'll just kind of give you a little bit of background on me. So I'm here, as she said, I am here in Austin, Texas currently. I've been here about 7 years now with my spouse, Jeff, who some of you may know from Chubby Diaries, my traveling partner. And yes, we move for Austin. And I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky, actually. So I'm very much of a Southern girl culturally, but I've lived in different places, so I love to travel. And I'm very much obsessed with the tiny living. I'm not quite sure if I'm ready for a van yet, but I will probably be there in like a couple of years. So hopefully I can convince Jeff to go that route with me. In the meantime, I wonder why this isn't showing. It was just working. We're gonna dive into, can you all see my screen at all? Let's see.
No, not yet.
Okay, let's try again. And that was working earlier. Is it showing? Good? Awesome. Okay. All right. So we have a little bit of time together. Thank you. So we have a little bit of time together. So I just want to thank you all. Like I said, I'm going to share as much of this information as I can. This will not be fully intensive as a normal course would be, but I'm going to try to highlight some of the points and hopefully you have some takeaways for our conversation. So just to give you an understanding of like where we are and where we're going in this discussion, I'm definitely going to start out with some expectations and agreements for this type of dialogue. I know we're virtual, but I think these are great to introduce because they're great agreements to have whenever you're engaging in conversations around tough topics and very sensitive topics like race and racism. And so we're going to make sure that we're naming racism in this conversation. We're going to create some opportunities for each of us to look inward in this conversation and then identify some actionable steps of resistance, what anti-racism looks like, what are some steps you can make to actively participate in dismantling the system. And then at the end, I'll create some opportunity for a little Q&A. And so just so we understand what I mean by expectations and agreements, I'm asking that you stay engaged and that you expect to experience discomfort. Because we're virtually, you're gonna miss that face-to-face interaction. So, you know, there's gonna be this tension of wanting to say things that you won't be able to say, but I would say that that is normal. And definitely pay attention to those moments. If you're a note taker, take note of where you're feeling discomfort for an opportunity to reflect later and potentially ask a question later on in the session. I ask that you speak your truth if you're sharing virtually. As if you're writing the comments, speak from your I statement, speak from your understanding and your experiences. That's the only way that this is going to really be an authentic conversation, is if you're vulnerable, and we're all vulnerable and are brave in how we share. And then lastly, expect and accept a lack of closure. So for those of you who like to tie things up with a bow and be ready to just run off and start doing things, anti-racism is a process, it's a journey, it's a moment-to-moment choice, and we'll break that apart. So just recognize that in an hour, hour and a half, you're not going to get everything tied up in a bow. You're not going to get every question answered. But those are great opportunities for you to do some of your own work, and look into and find a starting place for some better understanding around these topics and these conversations. So just to get clear about that. And so I want to start out with really pointing out, why do we even need to have this conversation? So some people are new to this conversation, so I would say welcome. I know in recent things of 2020, a lot of people have been shocked by the event, have been confused by what's been going around. Black Lives Matter is not a new movement per se. It's just taken a new name. It's a new generation, but the concept, the conversation, the requests have been consistent. It's part of the narrative in this country, and it's also part of the narrative when we're talking about oppression through policing and legal and justice systems around the world. So that's not new. But in regards to racism, I want us to be clear foundationally that racism is not just an American issue, it's a global phenomenon, right? And so when we're talking about being anti-racist, we're not just talking about here in the United States, it's about all over, and understanding what's going on in the larger picture of racism and oppression based on physical features and skin tone. And so it's important that we talk about this, because we are in an era of history and of time where you have lots of migrations of people. Globalization has been increasing the exchange of communication, the exchange of stories and experiences for the past, 30 years really. And so we want to create the opportunity or this muscle to engage in conversations with people who may have areas of ignorance, who may not have the full context, or maybe experiencing, have a different narrative of what racism looks like, and how it manifests itself. But the formula for racism, how we get to this place and how it functions in the larger scheme is the same. And so it may look nuanced based on local community, but I want us to be clear that this is something global, and it's important that we are considering the bigger picture in this conversation. Another reason we really need to have this conversation is because we're seeing what 2020 of how our connectedness is exposing things that are deeply rooted in our social culture and our socialization as humans. And so these crises that we're seeing across the world, and in the United States specifically, they're just showing our structural discrimination and how deeply rooted they are. It's just making it more apparent. It didn't just show up. Racism didn't just show up one day. It's been there. And so we're starting to see the fruit of something, or the symptoms of something that was never healed and never treated. We've never really got to the root of this particular type of oppression. And so we're just constantly seeing it take new forms. And so, whatever your thoughts and opinions are in regards to riots, the types of demonstrations people have, we still don't want to get distracted from the larger conversation that there's a system at work, and that people are having disparate outcomes due to this concept of race. And so we have to be concerned as far as people and as a community of what does it mean when we have people in our communities who are having different experiences based on skin color. And skin color and physical features are actually determinants in the quality of life, in addition to the length of their lives, right? And so there's a much bigger conversation that we have to be willing to have. And I challenge you as we're having this conversation, because it can be, like I said, uncomfortable at times for different experiences. Some people may be re-traumatized as we're talking through things. Please take care of yourself in this conversation. If you need to take a break, take a journaling moment, whatever you need to do to stay engaged, we definitely understand. And for those of you who have questions, we'll create space for that. And so in the backdrop of what I mean by racism, I am talking about a system in which there's public policies, there's practices, there's representation, and other norms that are going to legalize the superiority of whiteness. And it's really important that we are it's really important that we recognize the legitimizing part. So it's not just like individual experiences, it's validating the superiority. There's a structure and a backdrop that reinforces that one group is superior, one culture is superior to the others. It's not just a perception of an experience, but it's actually being legitimized by structures like laws and policies and cultural language. And so it also is a system that is allowing disadvantage. It's allowing certain groups to have privilege. And when we talk about privilege, I'm talking about unearned merit. Not like it's an honor to speak. We say that a lot culturally, like it's a privilege and an honor to be here. We're not talking about that kind of privilege. We're talking about unearned advantages. So things that were just given to you, afforded to you for, no apparent reason, right? You didn't ask for them. But then on the flip side, that opportunity, that access came at the cost of other people being disadvantaged solely based on skin color. And so structural racism has allowed that to stay in place, that type of disadvantage or imbalance of power and access and voice and honor to stay in place from generation to generation. And so as we'll unpack it, we'll begin to see like you can have players that started racism, and however you want to talk about how this came to this country or how we were invited to this type of dynamic. But this thing it's a machine that runs without needing the same players. You can change the people, you can change the leaders, and yet structural racism maintains itself, right? So we're going to create space to unpack that a little bit more so that we can understand how it's adapted over time and how we're seeing similar experiences from the generations before us. And so this is from Dr. Soma. This quote is something I saw. I have a background in like healthcare, health disparities, and working in environmental justice and access to resources a little bit. And so I was just struck by this quote because it just reminded me how large of a problem this is. And so she says, the air you breathe, the food you eat, the visual representations of what your future could look like, they are all distorted by structural racism. I don't know about you, but I guess you can tell me in the comments, like if any one word that would describe how you feel reading that. I know for myself, I was in awe, I was struck, I was kind of speechless. And I had to really sit and think about like, wow, even the future I would think of like and imagine is still going to be a reaction or a response of my experience of structural racism. It's still going to be what I believe to be possible or could be possible is still going to be touched or impacted by structural racism. And that goes for all of us. The way we see the world, the realities that we have, they are impacted by this system that's at play. And so for those who don't know much, there's all kinds of ways people talk about racism. I'm going to keep it very large, macro for now. So there's really 4 types of forms of racism. So that structural part is that overarching thing, right? Like it's the public policy, it's the language, it's the culture, it's the norms that we are socialized within. And then you have, those institutions or systems that make up our society, right? So we have our judicial system, we have our education system, our banking system, all of those things are institutions. Even the organizations we work in, the industries that we're part of, like the travel industry, for instance, or the community that you're part of right now, the Vanlife community, all of these are considered institutions. And so on that level, you can see it shows up in the way of practices that are discriminatory, policies that are written in a biased way in regards to race. And when you really want to understand about structural and institutional racism, it's really anchored in favoring one group over the other. So it's not about picking and choosing like individual people who are considered white and saying this particular person is superior, but the system itself is looking out for the interests of those who would be perceived as white, right? So when we're talking about access to the things you need to have the best life you could possibly have, when those policies and procedures and those resources are allocated, they're thought and designed with white people or people who are perceived as white in mind. And so sometimes it may not even, as racism evolves, it's not even thinking like, we don't want those people to have access. A lot of the times, it's just, this is our norm. This is who we think of when we think human. And white people are who we think of when we think of normal, of like, what would be the experience for a human, oftentimes the skin on that narrative is fair, is white, is lighter. And so the way they design things when it comes to access or expression or experience is designed to favor one group, how they can have the best outcome. And so that's something that the way you can tell when you're seeing institutional racism is that you're going to have these disparate outcomes. So we're seeing that right now with COVID, right? It's, we've heard people unfortunately say things like it's the great equalizer, which is very insensitive. It's not. But when it first started to happen, we were hearing about certain groups of people. And then as that information become more, aggregated, we're seeing that the folks who are having the highest number of positive diagnosis or the largest or the greatest number of deaths from COVID were from communities of color, right? And so that looks like, well, how can we have an open system of healthcare and resources, yet we have certain communities that are having negative outcomes, right? And so those are signs of things to pay attention to when we're talking about racism and structural and institutional racism, that the outcomes are not the same, which means everything is not equal. So that's just like an indicator for things to look at. You see that with school systems and graduation. We see that with the housing industry. And in the comments, I would love to see if you can think of any other institutions that affect you in the van life, that you're seeing different outcomes based on race and ethnicity. How would you say, would anyone say the banking industry as far as financial? Yes. Education. The vehicle habitation laws, yes, are definitely an example of racism, like where you can park, who has access, a lot of those rules, right? So when organizations or city government or local government folks are, even chambers of commerce, when they're thinking of what are the rules for parking on certain places, how much you have to pay, all of those things affect certain communities differently than those who are considered the dominant. Grad schools, yes. Parks and recreation, yes. All of those communities, right? All of those institutions have a normative that's based around white culture and whiteness. And maybe it's not even explicitly. They could have lots of employees who work there who are from different backgrounds and different races and ethnic groups. But if the power position is still made by people who are white, and the final decisions are made by people who are white, and the ideas presented and approved are by people who are white, you're going to continue to see these outcomes, right? So that's the macro level. And then we have where we break down just like on the individual level. So interpersonal racism, that's going to look like between individuals. So some of you might see that in your comments on your Instagram sometimes when you post something that people don't like, and on your YouTube channels for people making very explicit racist comments, racial slurs. Sometimes it's in public where people are actually things like microaggressions, subtle exclusions, or looks and stares. Excuse me, that also looks like someone assuming you're not from America, constantly asking you where you're from. So some of those things are going to be verbal, some of them are going to be nonverbal, but they're happening between individuals, and that's showing up. And then the individual level is really looking at your personal beliefs, your attitudes and your actions of individuals that perpetuate racism. And that can happen in a conscious way and an unconscious way. So for example, I know that I have grown up in a, let's say, working middle class, right? And so a lot of the associations growing up that I made about poverty or poor or the words like ghetto or hood, a lot of that association was with people of color, right? The narrative across the country, while we do have people who are white, who are in lower SES, who are in rural parts of the country, who are also experiencing poverty, the narrative around poverty often was demonstrated, or the poster child for that were people of color. And so whether I was aware of it intentionally, I was taking in that information and making those associations about Black and brown and indigenous and non-white people not having as much money, not having wealth, just based on this constant information. So that may not have been something that I or any of you may have wanted to associate, but those are things that are have been implanted in us in unconscious ways. And so if you've worked in social work, I know a lot of people who are doing nonprofit work, or who are in their desire heart, they want to help people who are experiencing poverty or who don't have access to things, but a lot of their unconscious beliefs about people in poverty, the myths we have about them being lazy, things like that, they still come out in our behavior. So that's the individual ways that we see racism in our society. And so I want to be clear about structural racism, because I think there is this myth that we're still combating, that racism is all about acts of meanness and niceness. And to be honest, that has absolutely nothing to do with the system of racism. You could be very kind and, like I said, still have those individual belief systems, those personal ideas and ideals that have a racial tone to them, have a racial connotation to them, and they are expressed in racialized ways. So it's not just happening to some people. It's not a few bad apples. We hear that language a lot. It's not just practiced by a few organizations or institutions. It's a feature of our entire system. We all are existing in this society and this ecosystem that's shaped by structural racism. And so to create a new reality, we have to deconstruct what Stevenson refers to as a narrative of racial difference. So we can't even really just make it all go away if we don't even understand what's at work and what's at play right now. And so I want us to spend a little time thinking about that. So we have a poll here, and I'm curious, when did you become aware of your race? So if you were to think about it, I want you to answer which of these ages or age ranges did you become aware of your race? Okay. I'll give it a couple seconds. We're almost there. 80% of you. And I'm looking at some of your comments of examples. Yes, these are really good examples. Redlining in real estate, gerrymandering, voter suppression. Yes, and I see a comment, Katie, about learning that Latinx isn't a race, it's an ethnicity. Yes, and that is a very interesting conversation, if understanding that for folks who are interested in why Latinx or Hispanic is not considered its own race. That's part of that structural racism, and we'll talk about power dynamics of why that group has still not gotten their own group, their own racial category. Awesome. Okay, so most of you have voted so far. So it looks like almost, well, more than half of you. So the largest group is between the ages 7 to 14. So I'm assuming that's up until elementary to first year of high school. And then that's right behind that is those who had the conversation by the age of 6. I am definitely in the category of those who had the conversation. They talk about that. If you've ever read Dr. Beverly Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Children Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? I fall in the group that had that conversation by the age of 6. And a lot of research shows that because we are in a racialized society, we are noticing racial differences. We pick up on the differences in human experiences. And so there's this myth that we have about children being colorblind. And that just lets us know that it's not true, that they are, just like any other topic, we are inferring messages about society. That's part of what it means to be socialized. We're inferring these messages about things that we notice, whether directly or indirectly, right? So it's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen like children who are sitting in high chairs and they constantly throw their stuff on the floor. And they are doing social experiments, right? Humans are constantly, so when we come out, we're constantly doing social experiments. So they are paying attention to how does my parent or my caregiver respond when I throw it, right? So they constantly see you pick it up, or they listen to your tone, or do you get frustrated? Do you get upset, right? So they're constantly getting these messages. And the same thing is happening when we're talking about race and differences in people. I can use ableism as an example. My grandmother was deaf. And so a lot of times she grew up in her era, she grew up in a time where children who had different abilities were hidden, and you didn't look at children who had, you know, different shaped bodies or had to use different devices or tools or accessible things to have more accessibility. It was constantly like to, you know, to not stare, right? So that type of messaging, even as a child, teaches us not to look at people, right? Teaches us to see this group as invisible, whether that's our intention or not. That becomes an unconscious belief that we learn to not see them. We learn to not think of them and their needs in a very subtle way. And the same thing happens with race, right? So thank you all for sharing. So as we dig into, I don't think I can hide that. So I want to see in the comments as we're unpacking this, I want to see how you learned about race. So we know when you learned, but how did you learn? And if you would love to share any questions, like the things that you were curious about as a kid, like what kind of questions did you have about human difference? But then also, how were those questions answered? Because a lot of times, there's lots of, you know, things like the baby doll test, things that's an old test, but it still has produced the same types of results around the world, different languages, children from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, of this preference of lighter to white skin of a doll and having associating negative things to things that are dark and to themselves who are darker. And so, yes, the doll test. And so when you were a child, you know, what kinds of questions did you have? Did you understand what it meant to be considered Black or to be considered white or to be considered Asian? I don't know how young we were in the census, but whatever your ethnic groups or ethnic identities were, did you have a framework for that? And if not, how did you get it? Learned about your parents. So I see Carla said, I learned about race when my parents were weird about me befriending the only Black kid in my school, right? So that's similar to like the child with the toy or the food. You notice someone responding in a way that you learned is something that made them uncomfortable or something they're not happy about, right? So even without conversation, we will infer meaning. So we hear people say a lot of times that kids that are colorblind or they like their friends, but they also pick up on how differently we treat their friends, which friends we are very affectionate with, which friends we're not. And a lot of times in the past, I don't know, 15, 20 years, the sense of colorblindness was introduced to us really actually more back in the 70s in the social work field as a way to make people not feel uncomfortable who were immigrating here. But what that did as a consequence was make us stereotype and lump people in large groups. And so we apply these narratives that were very scripted, very narrow to groups of people. And it made it very self-centric. Like, it makes me uncomfortable to have to ask you details about what's your ethnicity. So we're just gonna say, I don't see color. But a more personalized way to do it is to actually see who's in front of you, right? And so when we take that away from people, we're also missing the opportunity to enrich our understanding of human difference. So you can continue to share in the chat, because I think it helps. This is a way we can do some cultural sharing of just understanding what narrative other people have. As we saw, not all of us got that understanding really early in our youth, and that often points to our racialized identities and if it was a necessity to understand which racial group you were in or not, right? And so that points to that structural racism part, that there's some that is the privilege of not having to know or to not have to have that conversation, and those who are just by system disadvantaged by race because there's going to be different treatment and different experiences that we want to be prepared for. So this is a photo from a Chicago exhibit. I believe this came out in 2016, right after they were preparing for, celebrating President Obama, I'll say that. So they were really excited about him coming into office. So they started showing this picture around to show, really ask the question, well, what is race? And so if you could look at all the different photos of the different shirts, especially in light of us just now going through another round of the census, race was identified, like someone else told you what your racial group was. They told you who you were. And so you can see the structural racism at play based on how people would be identified by different eras in our country. So far left, We see that in 1790, this person was considered a free white, 1880 considered white, 1970 considered white. That is a very different narrative, for everyone else along the group, right? So even now we're beginning to understand the nuances of what it even means Black, right? So for this person here, it says 1880 they were Black, 1910 they were Black, and then 1980 they got to identify as Hispanic Black, right? And so a lot of times, even in February, when everyone assumes that everyone knows Black history here in America, they're not considering the nuances of ethnicity within what is considered Black, right? If you grew up in the Caribbean, if you grew up in Latin America or South America or in Africa, there's not an attachment to the same type of attachment or understanding of these heroes. This wasn't, that's not your cultural, those aren't your cultural heroes, right? But because of phenotype, we assume things and project things on people of color. The same would apply for the groups in the front. So in 1900, Indian, 1980, Eskimo, and then 2000, Alaska Native, right? And so this really points to what does it mean to be racialized? What does it mean how to have a racialized identity? And what does that mean in regards to self-identification, self-actualization, but then access to be who you want to be and express yourself how you need to, right? So I wanted to share that just as we're thinking through, we're coming up upon census that it's constantly changing, but for some groups it's not, and it's still not capturing the extent of who they are in the group. So what is race to begin with? So it's a socio-political construct. We hear that all the time, that it's not scientific, but it has been used. It was used in a way to allocate power, right? So it is socio-political, and it has an economic level to it as well, which is political because there are people who were considered property, not human, right? Using race to dehumanize. And so it's allocating power based on the assumption that skin color and physical attributes are related to levels of superiority. And so when you think about your race and how you're connected to it or not connected to it, you want to ask, I'm curious, like, what does race mean to other people, and what are they expecting your experience or your understanding of race to be based on how you look? Some people find it super meaningful and they have an expectation for other people to find it meaningful. And then for others, they have no understanding or connection to it because they may have immigrated here and race was not a concept they had to understand in the same way that we do here in America. So it's important to ask, what does race mean? And so you often hear people talking about playing the race card, which I find funny because it's always at play. So to say someone's playing a race card is showing a lack of understanding of what race is and what it's doing in our society, because everyone has a racialized identity. And so I'm curious if you all would want to share in the chat, like, how do you identify? Do you identify by a racial group? Do you have multiple racial groups that you identify with? And is that different from how you've been perceived, right? So someone may look at your skin tone or your features and assume you're one category, you're one group or another. I'm curious if you can share with each other, how do you identify and how are you perceived? And I think it's cool to see that because we have pictures of people on video. We can see you on video, and sometimes people think that they've assumed the right group for someone and be inaccurate. So I think it's important, perceive and identify as Black. Thank you. Yeah. And so a racialized, we have to talk about race because it has a major impact on a person's life. A lot of times we frame the conversation of race as just people of color. And that's not true. White is considered a racial category, right? And so for those who haven't really thought about what it means to be white, this is a very unique time to spend some time doing that. And why is it that you've not really had to think about what it means to be white? So thinking about the way you learned about race, what were you taught? Who were your teachers? And was it just, Mr. Rogers? Was it Sesame Street? Was it your great grandparents, whoever, were your caregivers or raised you? Where did you get this narrative? And how were you able to move through life with not having to think about it as much as other people? I think that's a really good place to start asking questions to really understand just how pervasive racism is, right? And so there's some groups who can go days, months, weeks without seeing a person of color or having any conversation or thought about race. And for others, that's just not a reality. It's not possible. And so race is a defining factor in the quality of life, like I said before. So when you think about what's been available to you or offered to you or withheld from you due to your race, what does that look like? What kind of feelings does that bring up for you? So for people who identify as white, if you're thinking about race and what it means to be white, has there been anything that's been withheld from you due to being white? Or do you have more things that you can think of have been offered or available to you because you've been white? And we can share that in the chat. The same for others. If you're biracial, maybe you're white and Black or white and Asian, like what has that experience been for you, folks who are not on a binary category, and maybe you have you're multiracial, like what has been that experience? Has there anything that's been available to you, offered to you, or withheld to you due to your race or perceived race? I know we don't have the time to go into colorism, but that does play a part of, some people who the language might be white passing. There's different ones of way people identify, but you may not identify as white, but other people perceive you as white. And so there's sometimes, I know for friends of mine, there's been this sense of guilt or discomfort of being extended a degree of privilege or advantage just based on how they look, even though that's culturally not their experience, right? And so I wanted to create space for that to be planted as we unpack, like, where do you fit in? Like, what's going on with you and how you've been racialized? Because where you fall in those categories under the structural racism system, if you're white or non-white, we're all exposed to some form of understanding about race. And we all have racial bias. So because it's the consequence of being in a racialized society, everyone has racial bias. Everyone has some type of prejudice. And so just so we're clear, it's this disproportionate weight in favor or against either an idea, a person, a thing, a group, just based on race. And it's usually an unfair weight, an unfair favor. So that could be positive, like you could assume the greatest thing about all Black people. I tend to be very biased in that way sometimes, I will be honest. But that's a personal thing I've had to do. I do that often to combat all of the negative things I've been taught to think about Black people. So I have to tell myself to start there, right? To start in that place. But maybe you have a negative narrative about people that look like you or people who don't look like you. And it may not even be from your own personal experience. It could just be on the stories you've been told in your family, in your community. Of course, media and stories being told play a role in that, but we all have some form of racial bias. And then there are different types of racial bias. So there's these associations that we make unconsciously, like very quickly. And then there's some that are very explicit. We say them with our words, it's in our behavior. So you could easily say, like, you genuinely can believe that you treat everyone the same, that you think everyone has value, that you love people, but those implicit unconscious thoughts and messages around race are showing up. So that looks like maybe you're avoiding people of color when you walk in a room, you don't make the first move, or maybe you go and look for everyone that looks like you. And it may not be intentional, but that's what happens. There's an association you make that I'm going to be safe in that group. And so that's where you go first. And then what are the consequences of racial bias? Well, one is prejudice. And prejudice are very interesting. These are these preconceived notions. But prejudice are very interesting because you could be presented with truth and fact and still want to hold on to the narrative that you have. That's how deeply ingrained prejudice can be. So for instance, I'm from Kentucky, like I said. So when I moved here, everyone in Texas was like, I didn't know Black people existed in Kentucky, right? Like there's just a lot of those narratives. And it's like, well, you know the history of slavery. There definitely are Black people in Kentucky, right? But people make those assumptions, or as simple as accent or the way people speak, if they're from the North or from the South or regionally. I know Louisiana has I love Louisiana accent. So like I have an affection towards them in a positive way. But you could have a negative one, right? And the same thing happens. So you could assume that, all Southern ladies like drink tea and whatever your associations are. And you may meet someone even in this group or at the next Vanlife event, who is nothing like that stereotype, but you'll still tell yourself that it's true. They're just an exception, but that's true for the rest, right? So that's how prejudice can work. That's why it can take a long time for people to unlearn them, especially when they've been reinforced without facts for a very long time. So if all you saw were stories of dark-skinned people committing crime, until you've countered that with lots of examples of that not being true, it's gonna be deeply embedded. It's gonna be your first unconscious thought when you see someone of dark skin, right? So that's how you can have communities that are very homogenous, that are deeply racist and deeply exclusive of different groups of people that they've never even met before, right? And that's how it works. And then we have these large stereotypes. It also can lead to discrimination, things we've seen like violence and genocide. So I break all that down solely to point out that like everyone can have racialized bias because it's a consequence of being in a racialized society. But when we're talking about racism, that only goes one way. That is an oppressive system that has to be, it cannot be deconstructed, it cannot be discussed without considering the power dynamic of it, right? What holds it in place, what enforces it, what reinforces it. There is a power dynamic, a collective power dynamic that sustains people who have and people who don't have. And so it can run with new players at all times. So when we're talking about racism itself, I'm talking about the larger system, not just between individuals. It's so much more bigger. It's so much bigger than that because people are, like I said, dying at early ages, are left out of the stories. We don't hear about their history or at all. You know, I know my husband and I, in the call, we talked about, you know, racism and privilege looks like your culture being the core curriculum for everyone in America. And everyone else is considered an elective study. Like you have to go to college and to learn about these groups and get a degree in them, right? But these communities and these groups of people were here first, one, or two, they've contributed to the economic power that we are in free labor and exploitation and all these things. And so that's an important narrative to think about when we're talking about racism. It's not just like one person who doesn't like you. It's so much bigger. When we're talking about what's going on in the back, and it reinforces these continual experiences. And so this is from Ibram. His book has been selling out a lot, How to Be an Anti-Racist. But this is one of my favorite quotes from that struck me in the sense of you can't really make changes until you understand what's going on. You have to be able to name it and acknowledge what's going on, but also your position in it, right? So if you are a person who is white, you have to be able to reconcile and own that the privileges you've gained, whether you've asked for them or not, are at the expense of other people being disadvantaged, actively, legally disadvantaged, oppressed, and excluded, right? And for some people, that may bring up this sense of like guilt or anger, but that's okay. Guilt is not a bad feeling. Guilt recognizes that as a place of, I think guilt is a great place for healing and transformation to happen because there's a new level of awareness of some type of offense and maybe you feel guilty for just not knowing. Maybe you feel guilty for the ways you've benefited, you know, you've gotten your way or you hadn't had to ask for things, or maybe you feel guilty because you've become very aware of like things you've said that are offensive, or you've minimized when someone has told you their story of racism or how they felt and you've explained it away, right? Like if sometimes there's individual choices that you have made that require some acknowledgement, and guilt is the natural reaction when you come into contact with truth, right? You have more information for a more complete story. So that is actually not a bad thing. The goal though is to be able to transform that feeling and that energy, right? Is to be able to move into action and not to be paralyzed by feeling uncomfortable and grieved, right? Because when we're talking about the large system here, people are dying because of this system, right? So it's of the greatest urgency that we get out of just feeling bad, because again, it's not about niceness and meanness, but that we may be able to move forward. And there's also for people of color who are just now coming to understand like what racism is and what it's done, that may also feel a sense of guilt. Of like, you know, I have internalized these messages that white is superior or I've internalized messages that my racial group is better than everyone else's. So there may be this sense of awakening as well, but it's different. And therefore, because we have different positions in the structure, right, the work is going to be different for each group. But we won't be able to get anywhere if we keep denying that it's real. So when we keep saying, you know, it's not that big of a deal, it's only in different places, we're doing ourselves a disservice, and we're falling sick to that literally, as we're seeing with COVID. People are dying at rates astronomically that they shouldn't. And disparities, the thing about disparities in society is that they're unjust because they're preventable, right? So race isn't a qualifier for being less than. It's the assumptions we put on race that keep people excluded and disadvantaged in our society. So to move forward, we have to be able to reconcile that. And so anti-racism is not a destination. I have to like stress that as much as possible. There is no perfect anti-racist, multicultural, inclusive organization or society yet. It's just not. But anti-racism is a commitment to a condition or a state of being and moving in the world. It is a conscious form of resistance. And so you're constantly, moment to moment, looking for these opportunities to disrupt the system that oppresses, because we are individuals who make up a system, have these spaces and opportunities of choice and how we engage with one another. And so those things matter. So we have to be clear that this is not like, oh, I'm racing to get to this destination, because like I said, racism will maintain itself. So we have to be chipping away at it over and over and over again until we get that critical mass of people understanding of, we're not trying to maintain a system where people can have privilege. We're disrupting that altogether, right? That's still maintaining the status quo to, you know, when we say things like share your privilege and extend your privilege. The goal is to not have a system where there's privilege and disadvantage. So that's a way we want to like frame that. And since we're talking about anti-racism, I would be remiss if I didn't say we have to be very clear about why you want to be anti-racist. We saw with the past year, or especially a couple of weeks, everyone throwing up black squares and using all the hashtags, and you know, whenever there's a social movement within different communities, you know, with COVID, you know, people wanting to stand up against anti-Asian sentiment, xenophobia, it's when when it's trendy, people want to engage in it and want to use the word anti-racist, but are not committed to that part of the conscious resistance, right? It's moment to moment, choice by choice. And so, you know, we have to be very careful and in tune with like, why do I want to be anti-racist? Am I wanting to be anti-racist because I think I should be and people are going to judge me? Because that's not sustainable. That's not how you make change that sticks, is doing it performative anti-racism doesn't really work because you're not doing the inner work. So I love this quote. And I think it's important to think of whenever you're thinking that you want to become an ally or you want to become an activist in any kind of way, is if you come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you recognize that your liberation and mine are bound up together, we can walk together, right? So that's to challenge any type of savior complex. That's to challenge any type of, I can fix it within myself, by myself, I'm just going to do it for people, because that's not what it's about. It's about that human connection of community. And when we're talking about van life, right, like all of you are a community. So it's about really creating a space where people of color are represented, where their voices are heard, but they're a part of creating a community. It's not something you just invited them to, right? It's their community as well. And so you recognize that we all can't benefit from this if only one group of us gets to be fully liberated and fully ourselves in this type of life. So these are some things that I say are consistent for things to start and repeat. Yes, it's all about community. So like I said before, you have to really understand that when we're talking about dismantling and being anti-racist, the work is not going to be equal, because the power is not equal, right? So due to power and privilege, if you're white, you're gonna have to do things different. There are things that you have to do because, like, I'm one of those to whom much is given, much is required. If you have a part of the group that has the most power structurally, then the responsibility is on you and white people to do their part. You as a white person have to really understand your privilege, how it's been weaponized, how to de-weaponize it, and to use it in a way that actually is to dismantle racism. That's not the work of people of color. People of color have a different type of work of unlearning the racism that they've internalized, right? The messages of superiority or inferiority that get in the way of dismantling racism in a meaningful way and generationally. So there's different work. And so if you're really about doing anti-racism work, you shouldn't be looking to, people of color to do the same things as you. We should not be using the equality narrative for dismantling racism because we're not there yet. Constantly locate yourself. Ask yourself, what are my daily choices? Who am I following? Whose content am I supporting? How am I spending my money? Money talks in this country. It talks in every country. So are you supporting, communities of color, small business owners? Are you, showing value of their content and their work and their products with your dollars, because that matters? Are you supporting brands that partner with people of color? That matters, right? They're looking at numbers. And so to do that work actively, you have to show with your dollars. It sounds very, capitalist to some people, but that's the reality of the structure in which we're working. People are looking at that information. And then also I challenge you to think about, what is the condition of your own racial identity, your racial ethnic identity? How do you associate being white? How do you associate being Black or Latino or Asian? And Asian is so broad. There's so many ethnicities. I hate using that. So if you could tell me in the group, if there's I'm always asking about new language, if the language has changed around Asian American in any type of grassroots way, please let us know. If the language has changed around Latinx, please let me know as well, because it's just so wide. So, but yeah, how do you associate that? Is it a positive experience? And if not, that is probably a good place to start doing some work. If you feel tense about whiteness, that means there's some work you need to understand, because it's nothing bad about being white. We're dismantling what whiteness is doing in the world, right? And how it's overtaking cultures or consuming cultures in ways that are not healthy. So that's fine. And then what are your own biases? And then the next thing would be to confront your racist learning. This is a process even though I've been doing this for 13 years, I am constantly having to confront my racist learning. I'm constantly having to look at, I was also an anthropologist. So I had to look at the system of education is racist in its design. And I have been trained to study people in a way that others them, right? And that's really hard to reconcile as a person, as a Black woman, that what is that curiosity of understanding cultures and what is it rooted in, right? And so even for yourself, whether it's your school of discipline, what you do for a living, how you've been trained, it's very healthy to really go back and looking at who were the voices that taught me how to do this. When I study history, from whose lens am I studying history, right? So if you're a huge, World War I, World War II person, and you really love to study those things, I challenge you to go look at the narrative people of color, those scholars, and see what those experiences and what that era was like. If you are Christian in a certain era, I challenge you to also look at what those experiences were like in this country for people who are not Christian. We talk about, church and state. So that's how you're really going to push yourself to really challenge if the narrative was centering whiteness. Part of anti-racism is decentering the dominant culture, right? So you have to get familiar with hearing other voices in nuanced ways, because a lot of times stories of our history of revolution and civil rights will make it as if it's always just been a Black and white narrative. And there's a whole spectrum of people in between, a whole spectrum of civil rights leaders that have done amazing work. And we don't get to hear their stories. And it's the fact that you have to dig for them is a sign of racist learning and indoctrination. And so I want to wrap it up with a couple of things that I would say these are 6 steps, right, that people can take to start their journey of anti-racism in practical daily ways, right? Because we are very aware that, particularly in your community, the racial bias is real. People are being profiled. Some of you have been denied services at places you've stopped, have been mistreated where you've been, or have shown up to events that are for the community and been the only one, and have felt like an outsider within a community that's supposed to feel like family, right? And so part of anti-racism is to really, when you're really understanding what's at work, we should not be shocked by racism, right? We should be anticipating it. We have to be vigilant. So when we're thinking of how to combat it, you have to know what's going on. It's the way it works in these subtle, nuanced, and overt ways, right? So maybe the profiling may not be calling people a bad name, but the profiling or stereotypical will be like, oh, well, we might have some Black people, so let's throw these kinds of on the food site, right? So these weird, subtle associations of like, what do all Asians eat? What do all Latinos eat? Like, and trying to push it all together and think that and call that inclusion, right? And so we have to really be intentional about where it is learned that that's the way to make people feel welcome. And when we say welcome, right, you're like, it sets up a context of who's inviting who, right? Like the sense of hospitality. Is this their space, or are we inviting them into our space? And that is a dynamic that we have to really tease apart when we're talking about community. So for these 6 steps, like I said, the work looks different for people who are white, and I'll distinguish the difference. So for the first one is the reading and educating yourself, like really looking at the impact of racism, how it works, how it functions in your life, and how it's been very real in your life. You have to have a real face-to-face conversation. And for people of color, it's looking at how has racism not only just impacted your racial group, but all of the non-white groups, including those who are biracial. Because a lot of times their sense or experience of not fitting anywhere is because we have such a structural, very narrow scope of what it means to be oppressed by this group. We tend to sometimes do the oppression Olympics of comparing one another versus stepping back and acknowledging that this is what's at play and how it affects each of us in a very strategic way. The division between people of color communities is to keep the power imbalance the way it is. So the more we're confused about what we're fighting against or what we're dismantling, the more it's at work to uphold white supremacy. And then we want to reflect on what your new education actually means for you in regards to anti-racism. So, do you have this mindset? When do you turn your blinders on? Like, when are you uncomfortable enough to just not pay attention if you're a white person? Like, when do you forget about racism, or when do you avoid it? And then for people of color, the same thing as you're learning what, the experience has been for people who are Asian since the 1800s in this country, coming to terms with like the language we've used to talk to each other or slurs we've used across racial groups, right? That's a coming to understanding that we should feel guilty about, of like, hey, we've used these harmful words towards each other, and that needs to stop, right? So that's the same type of reflection. Remembering how you participated in these systems and how easily you can slide back into them. So when you're reflecting on your work, just thinking about, where you've been and the choices you've made and why it was so easy to make those choices is important to disrupt habits going forward. And then for people of color, really thinking about how you've engaged in beliefs and behaviors that uphold white supremacy. So right now, the phrase white fragility is very sexy. Everyone's using it all the time. But I think there's another flip side to that of how racism and white supremacy has affected communities of color, is that because of our safety, we have been indoctrinated to keep white people comfortable. We've been indoctrinated to tone police one another. And to, when civil rights was moving, then not everyone was with Martin Luther King, right? Not everyone was wanting all of this uprising. And you see that with every community of color who's rejecting or resisting, right? Not everyone's on the same page. There's some people who are very much afraid and want everyone to calm down and keep the peace in the way that they've known it. And so as people of color, we're reminding ourselves and remembering our former understanding of the norms. How have we projected that on other people of color? How have we told other people of color to play small or to not say anything, right? Because that doesn't promote a confidence to reject a system when we do that, when we play each other down. And then you want to take risk. That's another step. So for white folks, that's challenging racism when you see it or when you realize you are participating in it. Like I said, it's a choice by choice, moment to moment engagement. So, if you are relaxed and, you're feeling like, okay, the circle's not as diverse, but you're not saying anything about it, you're not bringing it up. Every time you're with your family, you never talk about racism, and the only time you talk about racism is around people of color, right? That is a point of you need to do some more work, because it matters that you show up and support those people. It's the integrity thing, right? What are you saying about people groups and people who are your friends and who they look like in their communities when they're not around, right? That's when it really matters. So the work of dismantling racism within the white community is heavily dependent on white people standing up and saying something. It cannot be on people of color to do that work, right? Because we're already being oppressed with whiteness being better in all these ways. And then for people of color, sometimes that is, when safely speaking up against it. And maybe it may not be to challenge people who are white, but maybe it's challenging your own family members who are using language that is racist, that is dehumanizing about other people groups. That's hard for us too. So the same type of tension that white people would feel with white folks, people of color may feel that with their own groups and communities as well, right? But that's what we need to do. And then rejection, accept that that you're going to get it wrong. Like the idea of being perfect, a perfect ally, is rooted in white supremacy. Because if you unpack that by our social systems, white people have been taught that they are the knowers, that they know answers, that they know how to fix things. So when you're walking or approaching how to be anti-racist, you have to really unpack that you are going to get this wrong because it's been wrong for so long. So you're just gonna have to get over that hurdle. But then also recognize that you may be rejected by these communities, and rightfully so. So when you're doing the reading and reflecting, you're understanding what racism is about. Again, you're vigilant. You expect certain types of responses and conditioning of rejecting white people showing up in communities wanting to help or wanting to be the one leading the charge. Sometimes you shouldn't. There's moments to step up and there's moments to step back, but that should be part of the process of being anti-racist. And for people of color, like really embracing the feelings of trying to dismantle, that come up when you're trying to dismantle racism, like the anger, the frustration, the sadness, like allowing those things to come up, because what has happened because of white supremacy and racism, the dehumanization part has limited our expression of humanity, right? So for Black women, for example, if we are feeling a normal, justified feeling of anger or botheredness, right? There's this stereotype threat of, I don't want to be seen as the angry Black woman because no one's going to listen to me, right? And so we smother and shove our feelings down. And the same for my friends who are Latino, like if I get a little louder, everyone wants to call me feisty and, and things of that nature, right? And so we have to be willing to take those risks at certain moments and understand that we are probably going to be rejected from people of color as well when we're trying to dismantle racism or when we're trying to collaborate or build any bridges. That's part of it, but we have to remember the big nuance. Everyone's been conditioned to do this a certain kind of way. And then lastly, relationships. Building authentic relationships is essential for being anti-racist, because you're going to be rejected sometimes from your own communities. You're going to be rejected from other communities who just don't get it. You have to create a community that is inviting to different people. And so that's, one thing you have to keep in mind is that community, it matters, but you're not going to always be loved by the people that you know. So my hair been rushed through. So that is my tips and tricks and unpacking as fast as I possibly can. I don't know how far over I went. I apologize, but any questions? How would you like to do this? Thank you all for the comments and encouragement. I appreciate it. I talk really fast. So I was trying to give you as much as I can in the shortest amount of time. I can't tell. If you're saying anything to me, I can't hear you.
Someone asked, any tips for guiding reflections?
For guided reflections, yeah. So the first thing I always like to assess is like my comfort level as a starting place with race and racism, and really tuning in, when am I more comfortable and when am I least comfortable? and typically paying attention to the indicators of other people around me, right? So as a Black woman, I'm always talking about racism with Black women, like all the time. It's a bonding experience. We're always talking and sharing about our day. But I think it's important to tune in to the types of people within your racialized community that you are so comfortable talking with, because it can be very challenging to, whether it's political views or not. If you're Black and very progressive and liberal, trying to have a conversation about racism with folks who are Black and very conservative, right, brings a different type of experience than talking to like your white friends who are also very liberal, right? So I think those are opportunities to figure out like how far am I willing to be stretched? And if I'm not there, what can I do to build my resiliency for encountering those types of folks so that I feel confident standing up against racism when I see it? I think that's a place of reflection of just paying attention to what kind of people, what kind of personalities do I feel secure and safe around to say anything about? And is that the only time are those the only people I'm surrounding myself with? Because then I have to wonder how much work am I really doing to disrupt the system.
Facilitation. We have another question here. How do you reach out for people who aren't aware and want to have an open discussion?
So I would say for myself, I have had to tell people, and this has just grown in the confidence of it all, of just telling people, I'll have this conversation with you, but you really need to understand the cost of it. Because having these conversations with someone who's not aware is very traumatizing, and it puts a lot of work, a lot of weight on someone to manage your feelings, tell my story, deal with, that's a lot of facilitation, and it's not really a dialogue. So I encourage people who aren't as aware, I give them that disclaimer of like, there's a weightiness and responsibility for you to be the person who's ignorant in this conversation. I'm giving you the opportunity to do your own work before we have this conversation. And I think that's a very fair request, because boundaries are healthy. And, if you aren't in a place to have that conversation, I would not engage. Not at that time. It's a yes, but not right now.
Any facilitation tips or navigating the conversations? I guess that's a little similar to what you were just saying.
I am a fan of questions. I was a Latin scholar, so I always like to know what words mean, and I like to know the context and what people mean when they use words. So I ask a lot of questions. I'm a prober, which is probably why I'm a consultant or a strategist, but I ask a lot of why questions and how and tell me more. And so I think a key thing of facilitation, whether it's a dialogue or it's an event, is radical listening, right? So you are really paying attention to what they are saying and then asking about what they're not saying. So that's to show that you're engaged, but then you're trying to get more. I think that's a more fruitful way to engage in these conversations so that you can get a better assessment of who you're talking to and where you're meeting them at. Because oftentimes people are not talking or using the same definition of racism. A lot of times people are just talking about racial bias. And so that's not the same as structural oppression. And Casey, that is a really good book. So you want to talk about race. One, she's hilarious on Instagram, and she's a makeup lover like myself, so she has great content. But also there's lots of YouTube videos from Mijoma. The questions are going so fast. I can't see them.
We have one here. Does the existence of white privilege mean that because all white people are given undue racial privilege, even if they don't hold explicit racist ideas, does this mean they are contributing to the continuation of racism? Does this mean all white people act even unknowingly as racist?
People probably aren't going to like this answer, but I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to say yes because the way I see racism is indoctrination. So if you are the center of the knowledge and the center of the society and you are the center of the norm, then by default, there's no way you could be in a racialized society and not have racist ideology. There's absolutely no way. It's deeply rooted. So that's the part about the anti-racism, is that you're always looking for opportunities of nuance to challenge what you've been taught to believe about yourself and about other people. And those things come up. You are confronted with those things, you know, in proximity to different cultures, but also if you really were to be intentional about, you know, your pre-K to high school education, those are the pivotal years of indoctrination, how, you know, rules and expectations of politeness and manners and performance, and a lot of those cultural nuances are rooted in white centering, right? So I think it's impossible to be in a racialized society anywhere in the world as a white person and not have racist ideology. And that's mostly because the way, when you are the center, everyone else is the outsider, right? You're the internal, everyone else is centered or framed as the other. And so whether it's explicitly in a way that you're in tune to see it as racist, it's still been fed to you for a long time. So I think, yes, you could be, the racialized white privilege is because of the race category and what's afforded to you based on what you look like, what's extended to you. Peggy McIntosh talks about how it just refills every day. It's like having a bank account that just refills every day, several times throughout a day, right? Depending if you're moving from countries and places. And so because the structural racism has centered whiteness, where you go in the world, there's a similar understanding of whiteness and what should be extended to you because you're white, because of power dynamics. So I think it's impossible to not have racist ideology. Doesn't mean you can't unlearn it. That's the beauty of it, but it's going to take a lot of intentionality. And that's why I say you have to really ask yourself, why do you want to be anti-racist, so that you can continue to go back to that when it's time to, when you're confronted and challenged by people, and to not get defensive, because you understand how deeply rooted this ideology is.
Another question, how do we translate this wonderful content into life on the road?
So, because I don't live on the road, but I will say that I think it's important to think, consciously think about, even when you're isolated or parked somewhere, is to think about who doesn't feel comfortable here, who has never felt comfortable here, who did this land belong to before. I think there are lots of little prompts like that to really pay attention to how we take up space or use space, or don't use space. You know, thinking about when you're planning your stops, or you're stopping in a city or going through a city, making an effort to go to places that, you know, ahead of time, planning to go to places that are historical to communities of color, that you can learn about the community, people who've been there, or invest in the community with your dollars, like if you're stopping, restaurants, shops, things of that nature. I think those are ways to be intentional. It takes planning, but that's the point, right? It's like dismantling something is disrupting status quo. So what you would normally do when you're trying to be intentional, you are choosing to do something different. You're choosing to invest the extra time to plan and commit to doing things differently. And then of course, community, you know, inviting people. I think you can have these conversations. If you're driving with people, I think it's make these road conversations when you're out and you have your own time. What kind of books are you downloading on Audible? Like, you know, there are lots of ways to get content on the road. You know, podcasts are ways to listen. That's an easy thing you could do in the car. Historical books. There's just lots of ways that you could be bringing it to the forefront of your consciousness. And then creating space to reflect on that and think about, what do I do with this information? What can I do with this information, or who should I share this information with?
Beautiful. I think
and then of course, becoming friends, real friends, is important.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions. The next one is, do you have a best practice when encouraging interracial solidarity?
A best practice. I think, well, if we're talking about in the space of anti-racism, I think it's important to be clear about the definition or construct that we're working with. I think frameworks are important. I think that's been a lot of the issues in any kind of movement and unifying of different people groups, is when we haven't had a conversation about values. It's just like organizations when you have a merger, right? I think it's important to create ongoing space to process things that are confusing, that aren't understood, what are expected, because in some movements and events, people are expecting white folks to be silent and to follow. And in some movements or some gatherings, people are expecting them to know what to do and to just do it and not need a lot of direction, right? And so I think you can have issues when you don't create that as a starting place of how should I show up? What are you expecting me to, how are you expecting me to show up? And what is our unified mission and vision, and what is my role in seeing that to actuality or actualization? I think that's important when you're talking about solidarity, and that should be an ongoing conversation, because things become nuanced and we get new information and we don't always work with the same language.
Okay, final question. Do you have any suggestions on how to speak up when you find yourself in a situation in the outdoors where an adverse reaction to you speaking up against racism could lead to me feeling unsafe, but an unknown reaction if I'm traveling alone as a woman?
That one's very nuanced because intersectionality is real. And for those who don't know, intersectionality is when a person exists in the intersection of two oppressed identities. So it's not, it could be multiple things: ability, gender, they're part of marginalized groups. I think this is one of those things that safety is always the foremost important thing. And in your anti-racism work, you do not want to put yourself at physical danger, especially when you are a person of intersectional identities. I am definitely a fan of living to tell about it, to document and to warn other people, because I have not seen this nation really value the death of bodies from marginalized communities, right? So I won't say that it would be in vain, but I think it's a real life thing to consider of like safety first. So if you do not feel safe and you're not in a place where you're going to be able to secure and confidently know that there won't be a retaliation, I would not engage. I think solidarity in numbers is important, but if that's not an option for you, I would not pursue it.
Thank you. That was our final question for tonight.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And there's lots of really good comments and other ways people can support each other in here.
Yeah. Also, this event is recorded, so we'll be sharing it for everyone to have to look back on, as well as transcripts from the comments, because there are a lot of really good stuff going on in there that we can all use moving forward. Thank you so much, Denisha, for this enlightening workshop and for all the tools we can use as a community moving forward. This was really fantastic. Denisha's information is on the screen if you'd like to get in touch with her. And again, I would love to say thank you to LifeStraw for partnering with Diversify Vanlife and making this event possible. But before y'all take off, we have a quick survey to let us know how you enjoyed this event. The poll is anonymous. This is just for our feedback. So if you don't mind taking a moment to answer the poll. There it is. Did you find this workshop valuable? Please let us know how we did on a scale of 1 to 10. Yeah, and this is a two-part question. There it is. And again, thank you all for being here. Stay tuned for updates on our next event, and be sure to follow Diversify Vanlife, LifeStraw, Denisha Speaks, and Arita Aurora on Instagram. And stay tuned for updates on this recorded event.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you guys so much. You all have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon.
Bye.
Bye. Bye guys. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Have a great evening. Thank you all for coming.